Before we come to the next item of business, I am sure that members will wish to join me in welcoming to the gallery the Special Envoy for the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association Scotland Branch, Annie Lennox, OBE. Thank you. The final item of business today is a members' business debate on motion number 5547 in the name of James Kelly on bicentenary celebrations of Dr David-Livingstone's birth, and this debate will be concluded without any questions being put. I would be grateful if those members who wish to speak in the debate could press the request to speak buttons as soon as possible, and I call on James Kelly to open the debate. 7 minutes, Mr Kelly.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. It gives me great pleasure as the MSP for the Blantyre area, the birthplace of David Livingstone, to open this evening's debate. Can I thank all those members from across the chamber who signed the motion commemorating the bicentenary of David Livingstone's birth. Can I pay particular thanks to Jim Hume, who was a co-supporter of the motion and is a descendant of David Livingstone, and I'm sure will give us some unique reflections on the Livingstone family. Can I reiterate your welcome, Deputy Presiding Officer, to members of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association and to Special Envoy Annie Lennox, who has been such a terrific ambassador for the CPA on issues relating to Africa. Can I also welcome to the gallery representatives from Blantyre this evening, particularly those young children from St Blaine's Primary in Blantyre, which is such a special place in the Livingstone story. I think tonight's debate culminates a number of events, very successful events that we've seen over the last fortnight, including the special service at Livingstone Memorial Church last Sunday, which was attended by President Joyce Banda and the First Minister. And I think it's poignant that President Banda returned to Blantyre and to the location of the Blantyre Mill where David Livingstone grew up, because that is where the Livingstone story began. And what a story it is. I think when you look at that upbringing, the fact that he worked 14 hours a day in that mill, walking many, many miles during the course of that day, that such was his family's dedication to giving him a good education and his own perseverance, that he would return home at night and in poorly lit conditions he would read until midnight. And it was that platform which gave him the basis to then go to Glasgow University, where he used to walk every Monday the 8 miles from Blantyre to the university, and it's from there that he qualified as a doctor. Those skills which were very relevant to his time that he then spent in Africa. I think if you look at some of the main factors for David Livingstone in his life, there are 3 to me that really stick out. First and foremost, he was an explorer, undertaking 3 trips to Africa over a 30-year period. He was a powerful missionary for the Christian faith in Africa, and he was a very strong anti-slavery campaigner. I think the thing to bear in mind about these 3 aspects is that nearly 200 years ago, all these aspects were difficult to take on at that time. The infrastructure and the conditions in travelling in Africa were much different than they were today, and the propensity to catch disease was something that travellers very much got exposed to. The Christian faith wasn't as widespread as it was today, and indeed the culture was not one which was easily conducive for an anti-slavery campaigner like David Livingstone to get their message across. And I think that shows you the perseverance, the grit and the determination of the man that those hard-working ethics that he learned in the mills of Blantyre stood him well throughout his life and his travels in Africa. I think it also is worth paying tribute to Mary Moffat, David Livingstone's wife, and recognising the important role that she played in supporting her husband in his works in Africa. Much of the Mary Moffat story has been untold for a lot of years, but some of it has been uncovered by Julie Davidson in a very interesting book, which has come out in recent times. But I think if you look at the loyalty of Mary Moffat, what she gave up in order to follow and support her husband, the real personal sacrifice, losing a young child and eventually dying herself before David Livingstone through acute malaria, shows the sort of person that she was. I think in terms of looking forward, coming to today, I think the question we need to ask is, what is the legacy of David Livingstone in 2013? And to me, there are 4 aspects that come to mind. One is the fair trade mission that we've seen so relevant with the recent launch of Scotland as a fair trade nation. I see David Livingstone very much as Scotland's first fair trade campaigner, because he took that message to Africa. He really wanted to bring those communities forward, not only to give them something to live for, but to give them something sustainable that could take their life forward and improve the quality of that life. I think we also see the really strong links between Scotland and Malawi, something established by the last Scottish Executive and carried forward by this Scottish Government in the Scotland-Malawi Foundation. And I think that the work on that and the cooperation between these 2 countries benefits both of us greatly. And obviously in Blantyre itself, the birthplace of David Livingstone, the Livingstone memory and legacy is still very much alive, particularly at the David Livingstone Centre, where David Livingstone worked in the mill all those years ago. And I know that community is a strong, loyal and very cohesive community, and the people pull together strongly, not just in support of David Livingstone, but in support of all the individuals and the groups there. The 4th aspect is the work of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. And I think when you see the recent visit that Sarah Boyack and Alec Ferguson undertook to Malawi, and the reciprocal visit with the MPs from Malawi that came here, and it was great to welcome them to Blantyre last Sunday and to talk about common parliamentary traditions. I think there's a lot that can be learned from both of us, a lot of good lessons, good practice that not only can help our parliaments but can help the communities in our various countries with issues like poverty, human rights and AIDS awareness, which the CPA and the CPA envoy are very effective in championing. So I think the bicentenary, and summing up, Deputy Presiding Officer, has given us a great opportunity to reflect on the rich past of David Livingstone and to celebrate his famous life. But I think it also gives us an even greater opportunity to look to the future, to build the links between Scotland and Malawi, to celebrate the legacy of Livingstone and to make it relevant in today's Scotland, so that we can continue to serve Scotland abroad and abroad as well here as we do in Malawi. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This debate is very heavily subscribed. Speeches of 4 minutes. Jim Hume has indicated, unfortunately, he has to leave the debate early, so I'm calling Jim Hume first, to be followed by Bob Doris.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Apologies, I do have to leave early due to convening a cross-party group. I would like to congratulate James Kelly and thank him for allowing me to support the motion before it was officially lodged. Presiding Officer, this does feel a little bit like Groundhog Day. It's just been 2 weeks since we had a members' debate on David Livingstone, and I'm not going to bore the Chamber too much regarding my Livingstone bloodline, quite happily for others to do so, of course. But I think it's worth using this debate to look at what maketh that man, what drove Livingstone to find the source of the Nile, go where no European had been before, spread Christianity and be a shining light against ending slavery. Presiding officer, it's often asked, are we products of genetics or are we products of our environment? In Livingstone's case, I believe he was heavily influenced by his family roots, environs and external circumstances. If you look into his autobiography, he clearly talks of how he was fascinated with his grandfather's stories. That would be my 5 great-grandfather, I think. He was originally from the island of Ova, tended to a small farm there, and due to his large family, needed to seek employment elsewhere, hence the move to Blantyre. But his grandfather was keen that David didn't forget his islander values and would delight David with stories of old. That David's great-grandfather fell at Culloden, supporting the old line of kings, as he called it. David's grandfather was also able to go back 6 generations with stories, passing on the wisdom of those ancestors. Those stories later in Africa David reminisced over, as he heard ones wonderfully like, in his words, those spoken from the African communities, that shows that our world is small and our values are similar. To quote one of Livingstone's ancestors, he stated, I quote, "I have searched carefully through all the traditions of our family, and I never could discover that there was one dishonest man amongst our forefathers. If, therefore, any of you should take to dishonest ways, it will not be because it runs in your blood. Be honest." This family value, I believe, ran true in David's blood and is the life force that gave him the strength to tackle what we know was wrong, but at that time was the normal, slavery. That honesty gene also helped David's father Neil when he worked on those mills. He was highly esteemed and trusted, so much so that he was in charge of conveyancing large sums of money from Glasgow to Blantyre. Honesty was recognised. It led to trust, and also led to Neil, at an old age, being pensioned by the mill to spend his last years in ease and comfort. David was soaked in Livingstone family values, and further to honesty, had a work ethic that would make us all ashamed. Working as a piecer in a noisy mill was the reason Livingstone attributed to his ability to completely abstract from his mind surrounding noises, and he was therefore able to study under any circumstances. No one would have ever criticised the young Livingstone for putting his feet up after a hard day at the mill, but Livingstone needed a challenge and a purpose, and that led him to study Greek, medicine and divinity, leading him to join the non-sectarian, in his words, London Missionary Society. David hadn't originally thought to take his missionary work to dark Africa. His original focus was fixed on China, but the Opium Wars in China put an end to anyone from Britain travelling there as the empire became closed. So I wonder, would Livingstone be celebrated today if he had travelled to China? We don't know. Maybe doubtful, as Christianity hasn't really taken off too well there so far. But because he couldn't travel to China, he turned his attention to Africa, and of course the rest is history. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, Livingstone was a product of his family and their values and of his environs, no doubt, but also of external circumstances and of course those Chinese Opium Wars. But no matter, he's been a role model for us all 200 years after his birthday, due to his hard work, his honesty and his belief in what's right and what is wrong. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I call Bob Doris to be followed by Patricia Ferguson?
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I start off by congratulating James Kelly for securing this evening's debate. It is, of course, as Jim Hume said, around 2 weeks since we last debated this, when I had a members' debate before the Chamber. At that time I said this was likely to be Malawi March, and it's certainly turning out to be that way. That's absolutely no bad thing whatsoever. It may, of course, be tonight's debate, but so far the highlight for me was the address by Joyce Banda, the President of Malawi, to this Parliament just last week. A couple of things struck me in relation to that. There was a number of kind of messages that I took from that. One being that Malawi is open for visitors, for tourism, but also open for business. And a really strong message that Malawi wishes to forge even further, even deeper strong social and economic links, and of course that's something that was started many years ago, but also formalised in 2005 by the then First Minister Jack McConnell. I note that from 2005, £3 million has been spent on international development in connection with Malawi, although since 2010 that's now £4.5 million. I have to say that I am sure we agree as a Parliament that kind of commitment, that kind of bilateral connection that we've made with Malawi is something this chamber, this government, is in for the long haul. So, yes, of course.
Liam McArthur.
Very grateful to Bob Doris for taking an intervention. I'm interested in his points about expanding the tourism market, the business opportunities. Would you agree with me that actually critical to that is looking at the flight availability, particularly from hub airports? Because at the moment, diverting through Nairobi, Johannesburg, has to be a disincentive to trying to progress that objective that I think we all share.
Bob Doris.
I completely agree with that comment, and we have to look at practical ways where we can obviously take that forward. It's a point well made. I want to maybe just draw on the time I have. The time will be limited in some of the things that have resonated with myself in relation to David Livingstone's legacy. The first thing is, as people have said, not enough was really made of Mary Moffat's legacy. You know, first white woman to cross the Kalahari Desert, doing so whilst pregnant itself is no mean feat. And the active role that she played herself, not just the support that she offered David Livingstone, an inspiration to many women, I feel, and it's so often in history where the roles of great men are sometimes overshadowing the significant contributions of remarkable women, and I think we have to tease out, as has been said, the role of Mary Moffat, and to women today, some sacrifices they should just not have to make in terms of as they go forward in life. And I think a lot of the young girls that are here from St Blaine's Primary will take that on board as well. It's not an either-or when you are committing to a relationship or ploughing your way in the world. You should be able to do both. In terms of education, I think the fact that David Livingstone came from humble backgrounds and went to university, I think we can take a strong theme there with Scotland's steadfast commitment to free education for all. Is something that we all think is vital, and of course the commitment from the Scottish Government to spending £100,000 to put 50 gifted but underprivileged Malawians through master's degrees as part of the legacy. So much I actually wanted to say, but what I will very quickly say is when the bicentenary fades from public attention, we have to make sure the David Livingstone Centre in Blantyre and the monies that is invested in that goes beyond the current commitment to 2014. We have a strong action plan to have that as a hub for David Livingstone and associated activities, not just celebrating the bicentennial, but fit for the next 200 years, as I said just a couple of weeks ago. And I thank James Kelly for bringing this to our attention here this afternoon.
Thank you very much. I now call Patricia Ferguson to be followed by Margaret Mitchell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I too congratulate James Kelly and remark upon how appropriate it is that the debate this evening is led by the member in whose constituency Blantyre happens to be. Over the last 2 weeks, we have witnessed the celebration of Dr David Livingstone's bicentenary here in Scotland. President Joyce Banda addressed members of the Parliament and told us of the improvements she is trying to put in place in her country. She explained the difficult economic situation the country faced and her determination to improve the lives of the citizens of Malawi. And she talked of the partnership agreement between our two countries and the benefits it had brought to Malawi. She also spoke of our shared legacy from David Livingstone and the esteem in which his memory is held in Malawi. And testament to that legacy is the fact that it is estimated that some 85,000 Scots have some involvement in a project connected to Malawi. Now, this is the second time we've debated David Livingstone in the last 2 weeks, but a bicentenary is surely worthy of two debates. And my contribution to the last debate focused on the man and his motivation, and while I do not plan to reprise that speech this evening, I do want to return to its central theme. David Livingstone died most likely of a cocktail of tropical diseases, malaria, bilharzia and dysentery, to name but a few of those he is thought to have endured. His wife Mary died of malaria, and many of those European missionaries and traders who followed in his footsteps also died, often at a very young age, of those self-same diseases. That was a tragedy, and a visitor to Malawi will inevitably be taken to the gravestones and the graveyards with the names of entire families inscribed on those gravestones. I can testify that that is a very moving experience. But the real tragedy, and what should motivate all of us, is that many of those diseases still exist and still kill in Africa to this day. And to that list, we must now add HIV/AIDS. HIV/AIDS is, of course, not confined to Africa, but parts of that continent have been ravaged by the virus. Presiding Officer, in recent years, some of the work undertaken by NGOs funded by the Scottish Government has been directed towards tackling HIV/AIDS, as has some of the work of our CPA branch's Special Envoy, Annie Lennox. As we will hear later this evening at the reception that will follow this debate, the work that Annie Lennox and her aptly named Sing charity has undertaken has been carried forward with her unique blend of determination and sensitivity. Sing has identified a number of important aims, including raising awareness of HIV/AIDS, the treatment and care of children with the virus, and on empowering women to be able to make decisions about their own lives and their communities. Presiding Officer, David Livingstone was a man of many parts: missionary, explorer, cartographer and doctor, and of course a fierce campaigner against slavery, something he described as a sore upon the world. His determination was legendary even in his lifetime, but I believe his pioneering work on identifying the source of disease and of finding cures is one of the most important legacies he has left us. I think he would have been proud of the work done by all of those who work in Africa and Malawi, but would perhaps have been shocked that 140 years after his death, we still have so many of the diseases he was familiar with, and that HIV/AIDS had wreaked such havoc in Africa. For me, the most inspiring message from Annie Lennox Sing charity as it works towards a global commitment to an AIDS-free generation, a message that I think David Livingstone would surely have endorsed.
Thank you very much. I call Margaret Mitchell to be followed by Tavish Scott.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I begin by thanking James Kelly for bringing this important debate to the Parliament and in doing so for providing an opportunity to acknowledge and celebrate David Livingstone's life and work. It is a debate about David Livingstone, so while I'm talking here as a member of the Scottish branch executive of CPA, then I'd like to touch on his early life, his missionary work, his work as a doctor, some of the connections with Africa and some personal connections that I wanted specifically to mention. And I understand Sandra White isn't going to speak today to cut down the number of people speaking, Presiding Officer. As James Kelly said, the David Livingstone story is truly an inspirational one. Born in March 1813 in a single apartment home in a tenement building called Shuttle Row in Blantyre, and built to house the workers of the cotton spinning mill on the banks of the River Clyde. He left school at the age of 10. He was taught to read and write by his father, and he worked in the mills like other children in the village in the evenings from very early in the morning till 8 at night, and his day didn't stop there. He continued to attend night school in the evening, and for Livingstone he continued beyond that and studied far into night. He taught himself Latin, developed a love of natural history. At the age of 19 he was promoted, and with his increased wage by 1836 he saved enough money to enter at Anderson's University, Glasgow, to study medicine. And clearly I think David Livingstone is an example of some of the best Scottish traits: work ethic, the thrust for knowledge and the recognition and importance of education. He moved to London in 1840 to complete his medical studies, and at the end of the year he qualified as a licentiate of the Faculty of Physicians and Surgeons of Glasgow. The same month he also was ordained as a missionary by the London Missionary Society. In 1841 until his death in 1873, Livingstone explored the interior and set Central and Southern Africa, and he was one of the first medical missionaries to enter Southern Africa and the first in Central Africa, and he was often the first European to meet local tribes. He won their trust as a healer and medicine man and gained such a reputation amongst the villages he visited that he eventually had to limit his treatment only to those with serious illnesses. Much of David Livingstone's time in Africa was spent in what we now know as Malawi, and I believe that he would have been immensely gratified to see that the connection which he first made is still present, and not only present but growing through the work of the Parliament, certainly, but also through a number of very different initiatives, including the efforts of churches and schools throughout Scotland. As a child, I well remember Sunday school visits to the David Livingstone Centre in Blantyre, where the sun always, as I remember it, seemed to be shining. This was, I thought, a very special place to honour a truly remarkable Scot. So as an adult and an MSP, I, like other MSP colleagues, was very involved in the happily successful campaign to save the centre for the Central Scotland community from closure in 2009. Given all of this, it was a particular privilege to represent CPA Scotland branch in the company of Malawian MPs to attend the David Livingstone bicentennial commemoration service at Westminster Abbey last week, where Livingstone's body is buried. His heart, of course, remains in Africa, where he also left his mark. And to this day, missions of the 19th century are set up using his model in church, in school and in hospital. Just very briefly, tonight's event will see Annie Lennox, our special envoy, giving a presentation, and I'm delighted that she's accompanied with her new husband, Mitch Besser, as I know Malawi has very special connections for both of them.
Thank you. I call Tavish Scott to be followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Presiding Officer, just because everything has been said, not everyone has said it, said a very famous US Senator some years back. And I would certainly bow to the superior knowledge of James Kelly, Bob Doris and many others who have opined very sensibly on the history of Livingstone and what he means for today. And that was the only reason I wanted to make a couple of remarks this evening, was on James Kelly's latter point about the lessons of today. But could I firstly, just with my Commonwealth Parliamentary Association branch hat on, thank my colleagues for that, for what they have done in terms of ensuring the role the CPA has played in the partnerships, the internships, the visiting MPs, and also sending Sarah Boyack and Alec Ferguson to Malawi quite recently in what we have just found out in an earlier meeting was an extremely useful visit in bringing their considerable knowledge of this place to bear in other ways, and to impart that knowledge on colleagues in another country is, I think, probably sometimes the most useful work we can do. The purpose of also mentioning that is to congratulate Patricia Ferguson too. It's got nothing to do with tonight's debate, but I'm going to do it anyway. Congratulate Patricia Ferguson on being elected to a national body in the CPA. The BMR elections have just taken place. It's a very notable achievement for the CPA branch in the context of debate around the Commonwealth. I think that's worthy of some mention. But the 2 points I wanted to make in respect of Livingstone and his legacy were on the remarks the President of Malawi made when she delivered a speech standing just close to us here in the Chamber a couple of weeks ago, where she mentioned business investment. And both Maureen Watt and Jamie McGregor made for me two very sensible suggestions about what we could do in our role as parliamentarians in this place, and indeed what the government could do, the Minister in his place on the front bench, what the government could do too. The first was on oil and gas, where Maureen Watt rightly pointed out that our history and our involvement, our knowledge of dealing with American multinationals and their ability to take and make a difference, not just to Aberdeen but to my part of the world as well, has been experience that would be very relevant in my view in that part of Africa, and would clearly be of use. And Jamie McGregor secondly suggested the old model of the Highland Board, the HIDB, which was a very notable change in public policy right back in the 1960s. It actually achieved things in a very practical sense about farming and about agriculture agriculture. And given what I learned from listening to the Special Envoy in our earlier meeting, and also to Alec Ferguson and Sarah Boyack, it seems to me that might be a model that would have some benefits. Sandra White finished that meeting by observing that our best investment would be a long-term one, would be a long-term and sustainable one in the future of Malawi. And if that's the lesson that James Kelly rightly drew from his earlier remarks, and it is the theme that the Minister and those who come after the Minister, because I hope this will be an enduring theme for governments of whatever persuasion in the long term, then it is a theme that is well worth having not one but two members' debates, no doubt more to come.
Before I call the next member, I have to advise Parliament that there are a number of members who still wish to speak in the debate, and therefore I am minded to accept a motion under Rule 8.14.3 from James Kelly that the debate be extended by up to 30 minutes. Mr Kelly.
I move, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. Is Parliament agreed? Parliament is agreed. I therefore call Stuart Stevenson to be followed by Sarah Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And first of all, thanks to James Kelly for creating the opportunity for having this debate. And I think it's appropriate, too, that I recognise the achievements of Jack McConnell. In two fronts, I think he will be remembered over the very long term. First of all, for the anti-smoking legislation, which I'm personally, as an asthmatic, very grateful for, but fundamentally for creating the formal links that we have with Malawi. I think it's correct that Tavish Scott talked about that being something for the long run, which will endure the vicissitudes that inevitably accompany political elections. I'm delighted that when I was Minister, I played a small part, as many others have done, in developing the relationship with Malawi. The motion that James Kelly has brought to us today is well crafted and pretty much comprehensive. It contains a number of important points that I personally would want to address. Fundamentally, being part of the anti-slavery movement, I think, is important. His contribution to bringing modern medicine to Africa is important, and his focus on education and trade. These were all key parts of David Livingstone's life in Africa. And of course, his life in Scotland illustrates that he very genuinely was a man of the people. He was not a privileged person. He moved from worker to professional. He, in gaining his qualifications, had a much harder road to travel than those of us who in the modern era went to university, largely funded by the state, certainly not with competing interests, not having to have a day job while we undertook serious intellectual study, as David Livingstone had to do. He must have been a very fine intellect indeed, as well as a hard worker. And of course he benefited from the very broad base that the Scottish education system has. There is a monument to David Livingstone in Malawi, and it has under his name, it says, "For Christianity, Commerce and Civilization." Now, I think in some ways that may miss the point, because, of course, in Victorian times, we probably failed to adequately recognise that actually civilisation existed before the white man came along. It just was a very different civilisation, and one from which we should continue to learn in the modern era. He saw commerce as a key part of displacing the slave trade. Get a new commerce. That would be the way to get the slave trade under control. And of course, his efforts were recognised when he was appointed the UK consul for East Africa. I did think that James Kelly might be wanting to pair up with Blantyre MPs, so I did have a look and see who some of them were. I found Felix in Jawala. I found Geoffrey in Telemaka. I have to say, quite interestingly, one of these has just crossed the floor, and the rules of the Parliament there mean you're automatically ejected from the Parliament. You've got to stay with the party you're elected with. Probably not something we'd copy, but interesting for all that. But Blantyre, of course, in Malawi is a memorial to David Livingstone. 750,000 people with the Stock Exchange, the College of Medicine, Broadcasting, the Supreme Court. Let me conclude, Presiding Officer, by putting Livingstone in an international context. When Henry Morton Stanley said, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, he of course was representing the New York Times. This is no parochial interest. He was an internationalist and attracted international attention. Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. Sarah Boyack, to be followed by Alex Ferguson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. First of all, can I add my congratulations to James Kelly for securing this debate. It was an immense privilege to be in Malawi last week as part of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Delegation, along with Alex Ferguson and Fergus Cochrane, one of the Parliament's senior clerks. It was an incredibly busy 5 days. Both myself and Alex have blogged about our visit. I did a daily blog and Alex provided a fantastic blog at the end of the week summing up his thoughts. I think for me, as somebody who's visited Malawi now twice, the second visit for me was absolutely clear that there are huge challenges remaining in Malawi on health issues, especially as colleagues have talked about in terms of HIV and AIDS and maternal health, although I did feel that the projects that we visited were actually making a positive contribution, and we need to see long-term sustainable health projects. I think the issue of access to education, particularly for young girls, particularly access to secondary school education, remains absolutely vital to the future of Malawi. And thirdly, the whole issue of the economic challenge in Malawi, the cost of food, the issue of inflation. These are issues that are affecting Malawians on a daily basis, and you could sense the real challenge that ordinary Malawians are currently experiencing. I think there's much that we can be proud of, and I think the reference in James Kelly's motion to the 2005 agreement is actually our starting point. We have a fantastic historical relationship with Malawi, but I think the thing I want to report to the Parliament is that the people of Malawi and the Parliament regard that 2005 agreement, that cooperation agreement, as a living document, as something that is incredibly important to their country, and it is valued. Last week we saw fantastic local projects in action, and I think earlier in the meeting with Annie Lennox, there was a comment by Patricia Ferguson that 80,000 Scots have a direct link with Malawi. 80,000 in a country of 5 million. That is an immense resource, and I think our challenge is to develop the strategy and the long-term sustainable relationship. So our visit looked at local projects. We had practical links with our Malawi twins in the Parliament. There are 10 MSPs twinned with 10 members of the Malawi National Assembly. We delivered a workshop on financial scrutiny and audit, and we took part in the Women's Caucus seminar, which was focusing on empowering women. There is a huge amount of exchange of knowledge and expertise, and I think making that a long-term relationship is the key for us in Scotland. I was privileged to meet my parliamentary twin, Christina Chiwoko's constituency. The visit to the Joyful Mothers project the next day, where a local project is looking after young babies who have lost their mothers in the process of childbirth. One of the most moving things I think I will ever see. Speaking to the chief of the village, a village of 6 families in it, he was the grandfather of his new daughter, his new granddaughter. It should have been a fantastic celebration, but 2 days ago his daughter-in-law had died in the process of giving birth. For me, it wasn't just the experience of that family going through the tragedy. The village was coming together, they were supporting that young baby. It was also hearing about them as a village not being able to make the most of their agricultural produce. When the weather is good in Malawi, they produce fantastic fruit and vegetables. The challenge is they can't sell it to anyone. If you're in a rural village, there's none of the agricultural cooperatives that we have with our farming communities, and there's a real issue there. I think my second time as a visit, I do think there's an issue about the agricultural issues, the economic development issues, and particularly for the smallholder farmers. I think that's something we need to think about in terms of the government's work with Malawi, but also our parliamentary work, because as with health and education, we have a huge amount of expertise. The fair trade movement gives that a massive stimulus, but I do wonder what more we can do to help support those smallholders, many of whom are rural women farmers. As part of our technical assistance programme, we provided a seminar on financial accountability and scrutiny in the Scottish Parliament. I think when we were out there, we wondered about how exciting that would be, but I have to say the questions from the Malawian MSPs showed how important it was to them. We take for granted that if we want a minister to come to a committee to account for themselves and the budget, it happens, and there are serious questions asked. But in Malawi, those democratic structures are younger and they're not as strong. So,
could I just come to a conclusion?
Oh, I'm going to let Alex Ferguson talk about the women's seminar because it was fantastic. The last point I'll make, Presiding Officer, the key question for me was the Malawi MPs asked how could they scrutinise our work in this Parliament, how could they scrutinise our relationship, the NGOs' work and donor governments' investment in their country and in their communities. I'd like to end on that note because that seems to me a critical question. We've got the Scotland-Malawi partnership, we now have the Malawi-Scotland partnership. It's a relationship on both sides and that's got to be the sustainability for us, that relationship of equals. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. Alex Ferguson to be followed by Siobhan McMahon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm sorry if I disappoint Sarah Boyack and others by not talking about the Women's Caucus. I probably don't have time. But I want to congratulate James Kelly, as others have done, in bringing this debate before Parliament, hot indeed on the heels of Bob Doris's debate just 2 weeks ago. At least I can say this evening that I've signed the motion before us, unlike Bob Doris's, but nothing should be read into that other than woeful inconsistency on my part. Thanks to the CPA, to which I will be forever grateful, and to which I will report more fully on our visit in due course. 2 Sundays ago, I attended Sunday worship in Bandawi Mission, in the Livingstonia Synod of Northern Malawi. It was a 2.5-hour church service, and I would willingly have stayed for another 2.5 hours. Such was the sheer exuberance and enthusiasm of the packed congregation. A congregation that had had to build a new church less than 10 years ago because the original brick-built church could no longer contain that congregation. It's a congregation that had recently sought permission to split into 2 because it was growing too fast to be contained within the current structure. I asked myself what our own Kirk would give for problems of that nature. The service was effectively a Thanksgiving service for David Livingstone, for the life of David Livingstone, and for the missionaries that followed him, several of whom are buried alongside their wives and children at Bandawi, a stark testament and reminder of the hardships and sacrifices that they endured to do what they believed they were put on this earth to do. But throughout the whole service, it was the name of David Livingstone that provoked the most consistent and obvious reaction from the congregation, which was of all ages. And it's quite clear that his memory and his legacy are still held in the very highest esteem. I can only imagine that the reasons for that were those very characteristics that were highlighted so well in the debate 2 weeks ago, and again by James Kelly and by others this evening. His hatred of slavery and his determination to end it. His belief that education and commerce would provide the route to freedom. And his preaching of Christianity in a way that sought to persuade and encourage rather than to force his beliefs on any unwilling audience. It's clear that he was a man of great understanding and of enormous sympathy, one who empathised with those he worked with to such an extent that he clearly earned not their acquiescence but their heartfelt love. A love that has passed down through the generations and is as alive today as it ever has been during the last 2 centuries since his birth. Presiding Officer, at Bandawi Mission there is a nursery, there's a primary school, there's a girls' secondary school, there's a special school for the deaf and a medical clinic, all providing as good a quality of service as is possible in conditions that we would scarcely believe unless we saw them for ourselves. And I really do mean that. Given the paucity of those conditions, what is actually delivered is truly remarkable. It's also the most incredible testament to the life, the beliefs, and indeed the passions of David Livingstone and the ethos that he taught and personified. I felt quite incredibly humbled to be in that location just 2 days before his 200th birthday. It was an immense privilege to be there, just as it is to relay that experience to the Chamber this evening. Presiding Officer, I thank you.
Thank you very much. Siobhan McMahon to be followed by James Dornan.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I wish to congratulate my colleague James Kelly in securing tonight's debate. and in particular for giving me another opportunity to speak about my visit to Malawi. I never tire of speaking about this subject, and I hope I haven't exhausted the patience of those who have to listen to me recount my experiences again and again and again. During my previous speeches, I have spoken about the schools and prisons I visited whilst in the warm heart of Africa in June. I have expressed my admiration not only for the people I met in Malawi, but for the people I travelled with from Scotland, and in particular the pupils of Coatbridge, St Andrews and St Margaret's High Schools in Lanarkshire. However, when reflecting on today's motion, I decided to talk about another aspect of my visit that I haven't shared with many people since I returned. As members will know, Dr Livingstone is known for his missionary work. Although he is recorded as only having converted one African to his religion throughout his life, we know, however, the success of his work was much wider than this. As a Catholic, I found my visit to Malawi very difficult at times. We attended numerous services whilst there, in particular a Mass to celebrate Corpus Christi. This was a 3-hour service in the heat of Africa. It wasn't the weather that was particularly troubling, although it does make me glad to attend my local parish in Motherwell, now knowing I won't get sunburnt or sore knees from kneeling in the gravel. No, it was the fact that I was questioning my faith so much on that journey. Why would my God not save the children from the fate they are in? And yet the Malawians walked for miles in their Sunday best and stood for hours singing and dancing and rejoicing with others. It is that image that has consoled me since I returned to Scotland, and it's an image at the forefront of my mind as I began my Holy Week preparations. I'm sure I'm not alone in questioning my faith on a visit like this, and I'm sure Dr Livingstone went through some of that process. However, he overcame that to better our understanding of what the people of Africa, and in particular Malawi, want and need from us. We only have to ask them and listen carefully to their answer to truly get an understanding of human nature. Friendship was the most common answer I got when I asked the question, what can I do for you? Whilst in Malawi, I met a young girl, Rebecca. Rebecca is a beautiful young girl who is severely disabled. Being disabled myself, I was asked to meet Rebecca to provide her with some words of comfort and encouragement. Never before have I ever felt so much out of my depth than my encounter with this amazing young girl. We all know that in Malawi and in Africa in general, women are viewed as inferior to men. Young girls don't have the same opportunities or access to education that their male counterparts do. You can only imagine how a person like Rebecca is treated. Some disabled people are shunned by their families and their communities because they cannot afford to look after them, or because they think their disability is as a result of witchcraft. Rebecca is fortunate in that regard. She still has her mother. A mum that walked her daughter on her back each and every morning to make sure she could get to school. A journey of 40 minutes. A mother who picked that same girl up from school and returned her to the village to play with her siblings. Think for a minute how difficult that would be for that mother and the sacrifices she's had to make to allow for that simple act, your child going to school, to happen. Thankfully, Rebecca now has a wheelchair that she pedals with her hands. It takes her to and from school and enables her to take part in our community. But what about the others like Rebecca? What happens to them? Part of that answer is, of course, missionaries. They are the individuals disabled people in Malawi and beyond rely on, and that is only possible as a result of David Livingstone's legacy, something we should all take pride in. But we all must learn from David Livingstone and what he was trying to promote. It's simply not enough to leave it up to others to do the work for us. A wheelchair costs less than £100, and yet a friend of Rebecca's, who has a similar disability, is still going without. She's having to walk without shoes on the gravel road and paths to get to school. She and others like her need our help. Therefore, I ask those of us in the chamber and listening in the gallery and beyond to take up the challenge that David Livingstone laid down to us and do our own piece of missionary work to better the lives of others, both at home and abroad. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now call James Dornan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to start off by thanking, like everybody else has, thanking James Kelly for bringing this motion to the Chamber. As a new member of the CPA, I'm delighted to get the opportunity to speak on it. We've heard a lot during this debate about David Livingstone's enduring legacy, the worldwide celebrations commemorating the 200th anniversary of the boy of Blantyre's birth, and these are a clear testament to the impact he's made. Events were held from the Zambia to South Africa, to Westminster Abbey, which I believe the Minister attended, to all over Scotland, including Edinburgh, Glasgow and Hamilton, and these are testament again to the impact that the work Dr Livingstone undertook both across Africa and the mark he has left in Scotland. His personal legacy endures in the many memorials and places named in his honour across the world, including the city of Livingstone, Zambia, Livingstonia in Malawi, countless streets and schools across the world, and in his statue that stands at the base of the Scott Monument, not 10 minutes' walk from here. I don't know if anyone in the Chamber saw, but in the run-up to the anniversary of Dr Livingstone's birth, there was an interesting article on the BBC website about the gentleman that Siobhan McMahon just mentioned, the only person that Livingstone managed to convert to Christianity in his near 30 years as a missionary in Africa. His name was Seychelles, and he was the chief of the Bakwena tribe, based in what is now Botswana. Now, although Livingstone actually did not consider Seychelles to be a full convert to Christianity because he continued to practice polygamy after his baptism, the article talked about the huge influence he himself had as a missionary in Africa after meeting Dr Livingstone. What struck me about the article was the ripple effect at work. Livingstone affects one person who goes on to make an impression on others, and so on and so forth. And we should take it as a lesson about the power that our actions can have. And in many ways, this is even more remarkable because Livingstone's religion, although hugely important to him and the original reason for his being in Africa, appears to have become almost secondary to the role that he played in helping to improve the lives of the many who crossed his path. And this help was most stark in his opposition to slavery, as has already been mentioned, the slave trade. As an explorer of Africa, the finder of the extraordinarily beautiful Victoria Falls, and someone who was searching for the source of the Nile upon his death in 1873, he famously said in a letter to the New York Times, "And if my discoveries regarding the terrible slavery should lead to the suppression of the East Coast slave trade, I shall regard that as a greater matter by far than the discovery of all the Nile sources together." Now, those who know me well know that I'm not a particularly religious man, but as personified by Dr Livingstone and the many that have followed in his footsteps, we have continually shown the important role of churches in bringing aid and assistance and offering comfort to people across the world, including, and maybe primarily, in Africa. This was never more evident to me than in my visit last year to South Sudan and Uganda with the local charity Glasgow the Caring City and one of their partner organisations, Emerge Poverty Free. The Caring City's roots are firmly within the Church of Scotland, but although religion clearly plays an important part of their work that they undertook in Africa, it was no barrier to aid. Everyone and anyone benefited from the good works that carried out by them. Now, I've never been to Malawi, and I hope at some stage in the future to get there. Having listened to people who have been there, it seems clear that there's a lot of similarities between Malawi and South Sudan. They suffer from some of the same high infant mortality rates, some of the terrible conditions that women have to put up with, as well as many of the rest of the citizens. And the Caring City, lots of the work that they did when we were over there, we were over to see some projects that the equipment had been delivered to for education facilities, from nurseries right through to colleges, agricultural. There's a Matthews Farm, which was actually paid for by Roscoe Braith, who's a member of the Caring City in South Sudan, which is very much a community-based facility, which allows them to grow the fruit and then sell it onto the market. They also helped to rehabilitate child soldiers, and the breadth of the work that I saw them do took my breath away. Opened my eyes to the hardship faced by many, but also the great resilience and ability that the people are imbued with. As Jim Hewitt it talked about David Livingstone walking 8 miles to university, which registered with me because some of these kids would walk up to 5 miles, sometimes with no shoes, to attend school every day. Now, I see that I'm running over my time, so my apologies for that. Livingstone was a man who worked to change the world, who believed in the ability of one person to make the world a better place, and whose legacy remains a continuation of work in that vein that continues in Scotland and throughout the world. And I think we all have a duty to do what we can to follow in his footsteps. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I now call on Hamza Yousaf to respond to the debate? Minister, you have 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I undoubtedly have the best job in government. I said that at the moment. I was privileged and honoured to be appointed. Not only do I get to have debates that bring the whole chamber together, I get to do them twice as well. So in that respect, I thank James Kelly for bringing this forward. I enjoyed seeing him over those few days when we celebrated the bicentenary. Him and his colleagues, some absolutely fantastic contributions across the chamber. But I would like to echo many members in this chamber and thanking and welcoming many of our guests, some from the Malawian diaspora, but indeed the children, the school children in particular, but also those representing the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. So here we are celebrating the bicentenary 200 years on from the birth of Dr. David-Livingstone, and it is undoubtedly the values that he represents spell out who we are as a nation. But what a joy it is that 200 years on, that the legacy of that great man is being carried on by our children. And that was so evident in the bicentenary celebration. Every leg of the way of those celebrations, children were involved. And again, I'd like to welcome the children from St Blaine's School. And in fact, actually, the fact that they're still in their school uniform after 3 o'clock is almost like overtime. I think they should get the day off tomorrow, actually, for that. Luckily, my colleague, the Cabinet Secretary for Education, isn't here. But at the heart of every journey and every celebration that we had in the bicentenary, the children were involved. We had Martha Payne, a great picture of Martha Payne and the President of Malawi, when we were showing off, quite rightly, our civic society links organised by the Scottish-Malawi Partnership, who must be thanked for all the efforts that they put in. But not only that, I had the great pleasure myself of being at the David-Livingstone Centre, budding this time capsule with 5 of the schools from James Kelly's constituency in Blantyre. They were in great voice on a day that was snowing down in a blizzard. They were in fantastic voice. I would like to say I helped them to get in that good voice, because afterwards a teacher came to me and said, "I think you're the type of person that induces hyperactivity within children," which I took as a compliment, even though I don't think she meant it that way. On top of that, Presiding Officer, we were treated during the Civic Society event, treated to a fantastic chorus, a choir from children actually singing the Malawian national anthem as the President first came in, and that was continued by a choir, spontaneous choir of Malawian diasporan ladies who decided to sing to the President as she left. It was a fantastic occasion, the bicentenary, in all senses of the word. I would really, as I say, the President's visit started in the perfect way. She came over here, she made a speech with the First Minister. We announced, of course, some of the projects and the 15 projects that we've funded thus far in this Malawian development round. But her sentiments and the warmth that she had for Scotland and her delegation had for Scotland were tangible. The President's first words in her opening remarks on that Sunday when she arrived was that this, for her, coming to Scotland, was a pilgrimage. She likened it to Mecca for the Muslims, was her exact words, that this is a pilgrimage. And I sat next to John Bandy, the MP for Blantyre in Malawi, and he turned to me and he said, "I've come home. I've come home." That's how he felt when he arrived in Blantyre, in the thick snow of Blantyre that we had. He felt like he had come home. So the warmth was most definitely tangible. I'm pleased that the Scottish Government chose to support the bicentenary celebrations, contributing £400,000 towards ensuring a sustainable legacy from that. And a point that Bob Doris made quite correctly, that the David-Livingstone Centre being at the hub of that. And hopefully the bicentenary celebrations will go a long way in continuing and sparking interest in David-Livingstone, so that the centre continues to develop and continues to be sustainable. But one of the best projects I think that we've funded and put money towards is the £100,000 towards the David-Livingstone Bicentenary Scholarships, the programme that will give young, gifted but underprivileged Malawian students the opportunity to study at a Malawian further or higher education institute. I'm very, very pleased, because it goes again towards the sustainable development legacy that we want to leave in Malawi. One of the things I really wanted to touch upon was that idea of legacy. Many members have talked about it here in the Chamber. And I think we must live by those principles of Dr. David-Livingstone, who was called Africa's first freedom fighter by the first President of Zambia, because he stood for abolishing slavery and, of course, abolishing poverty. And Patricia Ferguson made this point very well, both in this debate and in the previous debate that Bob Doris brought forward, that there still is forms of slavery. They might take different forms, but there still are forms of slavery in Africa and even in Malawi. If it's tied aid, that is a form of slavery. Poverty is a form of slavery. Gender inequality is a form of slavery. Still fighting against those illnesses which eventually, unfortunately, affected fatally David-Livingstone and his family that is still a form of slavery that all of us must speak up and fight against. One of the good points that I wanted to address was made by Tavish Scott and followed on by Sarah Boyack, was that idea of how do we make a sustainable development legacy in Malawi. The truth is, Presiding Officer, if we look at development over the last half a century, over $1 trillion has been thrown at the African continent. Some countries have progressed, yes, but many countries actually in Africa have either stagnated or at worst have gone backwards, have regressed. Their poverty is even worse than it was previously. So how do we use our aid more effectively? I think Tavish Scott made the point very well, as I say, as did Sarah Boyack, that we have to look at long-term sustainable economic development. And so I was delighted that as part of the President's visit, she brought over trade ministers as well as the Minister for Mining, and we held, with the great help, and I must put this on record, of Anne Gloag, we brought together some of Scotland's top entrepreneurs, investors, and we discussed how do we increase the trade and investment links between Scotland and Malawi. And on top of that, we discussed how we strengthen the agricultural sector. There's definitely opportunity in oil and gas, there's opportunity in mining, there's opportunity in fisheries as well. So we will develop those links, and I've made the offer for the Malawian Trade and Investment Centre in government for a secondee to come and be seconded to Scottish Development International to see how we can increase their potential for foreign direct investment. So just to finish off, Presiding Officer, and to conclude, there are difficult times. We all live in difficult financial times. We know that. But we must never give in to the naysayers of doom. We must learn from David Livingstone's legacy, and we must speak, even if it's difficult to speak out in challenging times, that we must continue to show compassion, because that is who we are, that is our legacy. David Livingstone and the bicentenary, I hope, will have an effect not just on us, but our children and future generations, that we continue to fight for those that are the most vulnerable, not just at home, but across the world.
Thank you very much, Minister. That concludes James Kelly's debate on the bicentenary celebrations of Dr. David Livingstone's birth, and I now close this meeting of Parliament.